What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. What you're about to hear is the second episode in a podcast series hosted by me and my co-host, Grant Williams, titled The 100-Year Pivot. In it, we speak with some of the smartest and most plugged-in people we know to help position ourselves, our organizations, our families, and our portfolios for the once-in-a-century economic, political, and geopolitical reordering that we believe is currently underway. In today's conversation, Grant and I speak with historian and author of The Fourth Turning, Neil Howe, about his and his co-author William Strauss's seminal generational theory framework. We assess how well it has tracked Trump's first 100 days in office, how well it explains the upheavals we are experiencing in both Western and Eastern societies, and what reasoned conjectures we can make about how events will unfold from here. This conversation sets the context for all the episodes that will follow in this series. If you want early access to them, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed so you can listen to this episode and other subscriber-only content on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly thoughtful and clarifying conversation with our guest, Neil Howe.
Welcome, everybody, to the second in our new series, The 100-Year Pivot, although technically I guess this is really the first step of our journey. But joining me to take that journey, my co-host and good friend, Demetri Kofinas. Hello, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing great, Grant. How are you?
I am just tickety-boo, as we say here in England. Tickety-boo.
What does that mean, tickety-boo?
You know what? I have no idea. I think it's a...
I don't know how you guys have all these phrases. I'm always learning new British phrases from my British friends.
Yeah, that one, well, that's not going to help you out in too many situations, I don't think. But it's a very, I think it's just a very upbeat, old-fashioned way of saying everything's good.
Half the audience is looking it up right now.
Yeah, right.
Half the audience is Google searching tickety-boo.
Yeah. I guarantee you in the 1950s, there were all kinds of like music hall songs called tickety-boo with a guy playing a ukulele or a washboard singing about it. But we don't want to do that. We could sit here and do vaudeville acts, you and I, but I think we've got a much more important mission to undergo here, and that is following this trail we've started. And today we get to interview our first guest, and really the man who is, I guess, in many ways responsible for this, Demetri, Neil Howe.
That's right. I mean, it's right there in the name of the show, the 100-year pivot. And that 100 years really represents the 80 to 100-year cycle that is in the four turning cycles of Neil Howe's framework, generational theory framework.
Yeah, exactly. And, you and I have talked about this for many years. We've both had Neil on our shows to talk about it. It's a thread that's run through a lot of the conversations that we've had, and it's always kind of been sitting there in the background. And, the last... I don't know, I guess maybe since Trump, maybe a little bit before that, this idea of a fourth turning just keeps cropping up and up and up to the point where you just can't ignore it anymore. And it's amazing how many people I've had say to me, I felt like I finally had to read that book. I've been putting it off because, it looks pretty dense, but I feel like I can't avoid it anymore. And, when they do, they're like, man, I wish I'd read that years ago. It's that kind of book. But it does seem to be everywhere now, this idea of a fourth turning.
Well, you and I have talked about this before. I'm technically a millennial, but I'm on the cusp. I was born in 1981. So I have this weird relationship to my own generation. And it really was the slightly younger millennials, those born maybe 5 to 10 years after me, who were the ones that kept telling me about the fourth turning. And I remember when they used to tell me about it years ago, I was like, I hate this book. I don't want to read this book. Everyone's telling me about it. But eventually I read it. And it's amazing because one of the things I want to ask Neil when he gets on and we have a chance to start the conversation is what it's been like for him to live through so many of the events that he and his co-author William Strauss wrote about more than 30 years ago, starting with his book Generations and then with The Fourth Turning. So it's just been an incredibly influential book in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, and as I was saying before that, its importance seems to be growing rather than diminishing. As more of what Bill and Neil laid out as a framework happens, more and more people are looking for explanations for it and looking for some kind of guidance as to what happens next. And, a lot of it, we don't know what's going to happen next, but a lot of the really good suggestions are in that book. And so what better way to begin this journey than talk to Neil about generational theory?
Yeah. And the other thing is I had done an interview recently with George Friedman, who wrote a book called The Storm Before the Calm, which also relied on some of these generational theories. And so I'm seeing this cropping up more and more as a way to try and explain for people to build a framework to understand the changes that are happening today. And I do think it gives us some comfort. It gives me some comfort because it brings order to the chaos, to what feels like chaos. That's really what Neil, I feel like, is telling us with his framework, is he's saying, look, this feels chaotic when you're living through it, but it's actually, there's an order to it. And that order is generational. And there are certain drivers, and it happens every 80 to 100 years.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point, because having read the book and having talked to Neil at length about this on multiple occasions, I find myself saying, this is the fourth turning. I should expect this quite often, in fact. And so whether it's a comfort or whether it gives you a sense that you actually understand what's going on, either way, it's been very helpful in calming my mind and helping me make kind of decisions that perhaps in the fog of the chaos, you might make poorer decisions.
Likewise. And so I'm actually looking forward to being calmed down right now with Neil. So why don't we bring him on?
Let's do that.
Neil, welcome to the 100-Year Pivot.
Well, Demetri, thank you for having me.
Now, we're really excited, Neil. You're the first guest that we're going to have in this series to kick things off. And I was just telling Grant that I wanted to ask you, really right out of the gate, what it's been like for you to live through so many of the events that you and your co-author, William Strauss, wrote about more than 30 years ago in your book, Generations, and then later in The Fourth Turning. What has this period been like for you?
It's interesting. Very often people ask me that, and I say, well, in this respect, we sort of anticipated this or that or this or that. We're talking about the 2020s, obviously. But, at the same time, I feel disoriented like everyone else. I feel, what is America today? You know what I mean? Where is our Constitution? And I don't mean that in a good or bad sense relative to either party or, or either faction, because the signal characteristic of America today is being divided between two factions, red and blue. And, red is aggressively anti-blue now, sort of, pulling out of the stops, getting rid of enemies. We all know where blue stands. And this is a new reality. And people often ask me, younger people ask me, when has America been like this? And I answer both as someone who's lived in earlier decades. I remember being around in the 70s and the 80s, and I can't ever remember anything remotely like this. And going back historically, it's hard to find, obviously, except the closest thing we have are these fourth turning episodes in our past, right? You really do have to go back to the 1930s and the 1850s and so on. These periods of incredible partisanship accompanied by the seeming likelihood of very large and rapid changes in our political institutions. That's where we are today. But what I'm saying is that even as I see it and I recognize why we're here, I still find it disturbing. You know what I mean? It's sort of hard to take in.
When you say like this, what do you mean exactly? What is this?
Well, I mean, the rapid redefinition of institutions which we thought were never going to change. We always thought that we had three branches of government. They were all strong. They were all participating in government. We all thought that there was a middle. As you know, the founding fathers of this country, when they set up the Constitution, had no idea of political parties. That was actually a malady, the malady of faction, according to the authors of the Federalist. But we grew to adopt parties, obviously, early on. But even with parties, there was always a very broad middle, where the two parties overlapped. And that was actually assurance that no side would go too far, right? You couldn't alienate both the middle as well as the other party, right? And I think that kept everyone searching for a consensus. But there have been periods, these are the fourth turning periods we're talking about, where that consensus has evaporated. And we're in one of them right now, because right now we're thinking about Congress seems to be written out of the Constitution. And it looks like very soon, a few weeks for some of these contempt cases are coming before the courts, and maybe a few months before the Supreme Court starts actually ruling on the merits of some of the big things that Trump is doing now, that very soon we're going to see a confrontation between the executive and the judiciary. That's the third branch of our government. And it's likely that in some way the judiciary could be rolled. And if that happens, of course, that could lead to very unpredictable consequences for our situation here domestically, politically, institutionally, constitutionally.
Neil, when I read the book and when I spoke to you about this, and when I go back and revisit it and I look at the potted descriptions of the turnings, just to give people a vague idea of what they are, the fourth turning you characterize so beautifully about the fact that it's a period of conflict and turbulence and can, in many cases, lead to war. But then you talk about the fact that one characteristic of a fourth turning is the tearing down of institutions that are no longer kind of fit for purpose, and the rebuilding in the first turning of new institutions that serve the people better. And from the time I read the book, which is many years ago now, to now, I've had in mind the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and now NATO. And these kind of things make sense to me as institutions that were built in the first turning and may no longer be fit for purpose. What I hadn't really thought about in terms of institutions in that particular bind are things like the three branches of the US government, the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights. These, I never thought of them as institutions. They are institutional, but I guess because there's no bricks and mortar, there's no headquarters, there's no figurehead, there's no nothing of them, I never really thought about them as being vulnerable. And now, to your point there, and looking at what's happening with a lot of the lawfare going on in the US and some of the moves, as you say, on Team Red and Team Blue over the last several years, it feels to me like it has the potential to be a far more existential crisis when we look at America in particular, because it does have those two beautiful documents at the core of its existence. And if you start tearing at those the way that we're seeing, it opens up a whole new set of questions, not how is the world put together and do we reverse globalization, but the question of what is America, even though people are kind of asking it, if you ask what is America within the context of maybe the Constitution, the Bill of Rights no longer hold, that's a very, very different question we're asking.
It is. It is. That's why I say I am taken aback often by what I see, and it's trying to reinterpret it. However, I will say that it's always been part of our thesis that this reshaping of government political institutions did include our core institutions and our understanding of the Constitution. Bruce Ackerman, who's a professor of kind of constitutional history at Yale, has written about this. I mean, he's written several books about this, about how the whole history of the Constitution is a punctuated equilibrium. We started with this bold new experiment, the miracle of 1787, 88 in Philadelphia, which was finally ratified. And then we went through a period of relative stasis. And then, of course, we went through the Civil War, and we had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, right? And we decided a lot of issues that weren't decided, right? In other words, the supremacy clause, above all. It turned out states did not have the option of pulling out of this, right? Well, that was fundamental. And by the way, to underline how fundamental that is a single question that people are asking about the EU. I mean, why is it that a single state like Hungary can just paralyze everything, right? In other words, EU hasn't yet settled that. And the whole problem, to some extent, with the EU, for instance, in devising foreign policy, which now they're kind of panicking about. I mean, they better be able to do something collectively, particularly if the United States is no longer there. But they're dealing with this problem. And it all goes back to what people often said that was distinctive about the EU. It was just a bureaucratic merger. Europe never had its civil war, right, to make sure that one power dominated. In fact, it was the policy of Britain in particular, and often with the aid of America, to prevent Europe from having one. You know what I mean? I mean, Britain was always an offshore equalizer of the balance of power to prevent one power from ever gaining control of Europe. So that's an interesting difference. Okay, and then you go ahead, another long human lifetime, and you get to the 1930s. And there you had a completely new understanding of the Constitution, particularly this broad, sweeping new interpretation of the Commerce Clause, which basically allowed the federal government to do anything it wanted to. which had never been true before. And then you have stasis again, people working within that. I think we're at another one of those fissures, although I will say here, the extent to which so many of the underlying relationships are being questioned is stunning even to me. And having said that, and I just want to do this because kick off another direction of this conversation, it is still unclear to me whether or not the fourth turning in America will climax with internal conflict or with external conflict. That remains sort of an open question.
So, Neil, I think that we'll have an opportunity to get to that question about internal versus external conflict, and I think it's very important. But before we do, we're actually recording this just a few days, and it's going to be released on the 100th or 101st day since Trump's inauguration. So we're in that 100-day window. What is your impression, and what is sort of your takeaway of these first 100 days of the Trump administration?
Well, the obvious comparison of the 100 days is to the 100 days of FDR, right? I mean, that's where we get that comparison. So FDR came in 1932. Let's talk about similarities and differences. One obvious similarity is that FDR was a bundle of activity, right? Huge amount of energy, huge amounts of new initiative came out of the brain trust with all these new agencies, with all these new programs. Some of them probably did more damage than good. The NRA, for example, National Recovery Administration, probably was, a terrible idea. Other things were good ideas, like going up the gold standard. It was probably high time the United States had to do that. Anyway, Trump had all of these new agencies and programs. He was a bundle of activity, and he wasn't above partisanship to talk about the need for this new activity, right? He waxed into high gear really on his reelection in 1936, where he talked about the economic royalists and all the plutocrats who were standing in the way of progress. In other words, FDR had enemies. And there was this great speech he once gave in Madison Square Garden where he talked about all the terrible things that people were saying about him. And he stretched out his arms and he said, I glory in their hatred. That's kind of a Trump-like thing to say, and then the more they hate me, the more I love it. So in other words, the partisanship and the energy, right, are very similar. And that sense of transforming the nation in the face of a crisis. Now, that's an interesting thing, the face of a crisis. Trump did not come into office with double-digit unemployment and 20-30% decline in GDP. Although, interestingly, he may be the first president to actually cause that. His declaration of emergency comes before the emergency, whereas it happened the other way around with FDR. But, it's very interesting. Having said that, I will say that when you question Americans about their pessimism about the future, I have never seen Americans more pessimistic. There is a chord when he talks about America facing an emergency. Most Americans actually think, yeah, right now our economy is fine. And we found that even at the height of the COVID crisis, when the Fed and Treasury were out there, they're making everyone flush, putting money into their bank accounts. Everyone said, yeah, right now I'm feeling fine. But I feel this horrible sense of pessimism about where America is going. And that is actually even, that's higher now. We'll see how higher it may get when even their near-term future looks bad. When America actually does go into recession, it might get even worse. But my point is, that looks different, but in some ways it's the same. Let me point out a couple of the differences, however. Maybe just two of them for starters, and then you guys can follow up. One is that everything FDR did was through Congress. He went down there, he went in the morning, he'd come out with his brain trust, he would have some new idea, whether it's the SEC or whether it's the AAA or whatever new agency he had. He would formulate the legislation with his brain trust, he'd get it ready in the morning, he'd march it over to the House, they would pass it by noon, he would march it over to the Senate, they would pass it by afternoon, and by evening, he would sign the damn. That's how fast this was happening. And very often, of course, they didn't even have time to read the thing. But there was a sense of crisis, and they approved it. Now, you could say, well, they didn't have time to read it. They're kind of compelled. Here was this guy saying, this is our only chance. On the other hand, he did get it approved, right? In other words, everything was through legislation. It was all through Congress. It was not this executive order thing, which is leading Trump to such a titanic collision with the Supreme Court, right? And it's inevitable that that's going to happen.
How much of that, though, also reflects the difference, which is that FDR had both a Democratic Senate and Democratic Congress?
Well, thank you, Demetri, because that's the second difference I was about to bring out. So FDR came in 1932 with, 16, 17% majority in the vote. And of course, he dominated the House and he had a substantial majority in the Senate. And that was even more lopsided in 1936. So yes, that's the other difference. And that's the problem, right? In this respect, it's a little bit more like the 1850s, where you have two almost equal strength groups, right, that cannot reconcile their differences, right?
Yeah. Going back to the 1850s, when we look at the parallels, we're looking at the 1920s, 30s, we're looking at the recovery from the Great Depression. We go back to the 1950s and we're looking at the period before the Civil War. And the 1850s period, Neil, was obviously something which the US didn't recover from without the conflict that you and Bill had talked about being the kind of climactic happening of a fourth turning. And so when you look at the level of conflict, and let's just stay in the United States for the time being, we can get to kinetic conflict in the world a little later on. But you made the point about how divided red and blue are, and there's real enmity on both sides there. And you're seeing that same conflict between rich and poor. You're seeing the same one between boomers and millennials. You're seeing the same one everywhere you look. There's blue collar America and white collar America. It's very difficult to figure out where some kind of rapprochement can really occur, because it seems to be that in order for that to happen, one side of every single one of those arguments is going to have to concede an awful lot to the other side. If it's boomers and millennials, we're talking a big transfer of wealth. If it's left against right, red against blue, we're going to have to concede an awful lot of points that both sides are incredibly entrenched upon. If it's blue collar and white collar, we're going to have to see a lot of white collar jobs go and blue collar jobs come back. Whichever way you look, there's no, it seems to me, I'd be curious your thoughts on it, there's no straightforward path whereby we can engineer this coming together again without some kind of duel, if you like.
Well, events have a way of achieving these things. You know what I mean? One of the patterns of fourth turnings has been that society obviously mobilizes, for conflict. One of the enduring themes of my book, and I quote, I don't know how many social scientists from the late 19th century, from Durkheim to Weber to, William Graham Sumner and all these people, is that conflict is the incubator of community. I mean, if there is one truism among social scientists, it's that. And that's an issue for societies that are a long lifetime away from any sort of conflict, right? Why is there any community? And when I look at young people today, and I survey them, I talk to them, the one thing they miss the most is community. Loneliness is one of their biggest problems. And just finding a connection, knowing why they're here. Does anyone need them? What uses their energy? Where do they connect with others with kind of a broader sense of what we're all about? That is what fourth turnings do, right? To go back to the things you were talking about, these large shifts, like inequality and so on.
Yep.
There are fourth turning patterns. Fourth turnings always lead to a reduction in inequality, a very sharp and radical reduction. In fact, Thomas Piketty in his book, Capital, you remember that book that came out, a decade ago? Yeah, and he said, I think R is larger than G, the rate of return on capital is larger than the growth rate of the economy. So the rich always get richer, and the poor wage slobs, never keep up. And he said, yes, that's just the rule of all of history. They said, yeah, but there's a great exception. He admitted there's a great exception. And that's what happened in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s, And then, of course, that was the fourth turning and the first turning, which followed, which in, my rubric is sort of the fourth turning and the first turning are times when inequality falls. I mean, that's part of the pattern that we see. And when community is strong, inequality weakens. And you can see how that happened in both the Great Depression, obviously destroying market value of a lot of the wealthy people, and then the mobilization for war and inflation. Inflation plus financial repression hugely undermined the wealth of the rich. who were basically forced to invest in all these treasury securities that were losing real value, and very high real wages for workers and for soldiers and for all the benefits of all those who came home. So you saw a much more equal America by the late 1950s and most extremely by the late 1960s, when boomers coming of age thought the middle class was far too powerful, far too big. Boomers hated it. All of us hated the middle class. And today, millennials, it's like, where is the middle class? Where do I sign up? All these beautiful little colored houses, they all look just the same. That sounds like paradise. Where do I get them? Well, sorry, we got rid of them, that kind of thing. But that's my point. So in other words, fourth turning solved that. Fourth turning solved the problem of community. And ultimately, the fourth turning typically also brings about a conservative, but I will say rather a conventional trend in the culture. And that's always happened with fourth turnings, with conflict, with a feeling of, precarity, with a feeling that great events are about to happen. The culture tends to turn in a conventional direction. And many people are seeing that today, sort of this, vibe, the somewhat conservative vibe in the culture. A very interesting thing that is very much talked about today, which again, we predicted. I talked about it in my most recent book, I was predicting, is a larger gap between gender roles among young adults. And I talked about that at some length in the book. And I think we're really seeing that now. We're seeing that particularly in voting and even in attitudes toward religion. We're seeing an increased gender gap among young people, which is where new social changes always appear initially, is among the rising generation.
Neil, I have a question, because it's hard to separate out, I guess, to distinguish between what it's like to live. I keep coming back to this point that it's one thing to read about a time in history or to think about what the future might look like. It's another thing to live through it. And so I'm hesitant to make statements in comparison between or comparing FDR to Trump, but at least in my reading of the history, FDR was much more of a builder. And yes, there was a lot of experimentation. That was a core part of FDR's presidency. It was about experimentation and trying to figure out a solution. But with the Trump administration, it feels much more rudderless. And also, Trump and the wave of populism that elected him seems to be much more invigorated by the prospects of tearing down institutions rather than building them up, which is what FDR did. FDR built up, after all, so many of the institutions that we have still to this day. And so my question really is, how real are those distinctions? Or are they just because of how we're telling the story now and we're going to tell it differently when Trump leaves office? Or does it suggest maybe that Trump is not the equivalent of an FDR and that Trump's role is to tear things down and the person that comes after Trump will be there to build anew?
Well, look, this all has to do with how MAGA sees itself, right? I think, an outsider sees, MAGA versus how MAGA sees itself. I think MAGA sees itself as tearing down in order to build up. The whole idea is a more autarkic America will have, working class people working again, right? And we'll have higher wages relative to rich people, and we will be an invigorated society. You see Trump occasionally talks about an America that can build ships again, that can do heavy industry again, that can do all these things, which he said, if we don't do those things, we're sunk. We can't possibly survive, even as a point of national security, which, is an arguable point. You can talk about the merits of that. But here's what I would say to your basic question. I think your underlying question is a really good one. What are we missing when we talk about people historically? And I've thought about that a lot. In fact, I don't know any historian who hasn't really thought about that, right? And I've come to the conclusion, I think many other people have conclusion, that the single biggest thing we forget when we look at people historically is we forget that they didn't know how anything was going to turn out. That's the single biggest fact. In FDR, the nation was crushed. When FDR had his initial inauguration, banks were closed in half the states. The exchanges were closed. This was a completely helpless nation. You had food lines outside of government agencies that had run out of money. State and local organizations run out of money. And the other thing to see is that much of what FDR did at the time really didn't do a hell of a lot. The country went into a huge recession again in 1937 and a 50% decline again in the stock market. And by early 1940, we still had deflation. US long-term bonds were at their lowest ever level in our history until post-GFC, all that nonsense, all the, what happened then, right? And unemployment was still in double digits. So in other words, it wasn't like anyone felt that FDR had brought America out of the Great Depression. America was still that's why it was a Great Depression. We were still mired, and no one had any idea what the future was going to be. That began to change, interestingly enough, now that we're on this topic, starting in June of 1940. And June of 1940, something happened which no one expected. France fell to Germany in 4 weeks. I mean, no one believed it. France fell about as rapidly as Poland. Absolutely no one anticipated that. Everyone thought this would be a huge slugfest. It would go on for years. It'd be like World War I. France had an enormous military. Well, it turned out that France was as riven internally between Marxists and fascists as, a lot of other societies are in a fourth turning, right? And it put up a pathetic defense, right? So they sliced right through the Ardennes. They got to Paris. Suddenly, the mood in America began to change. And it was that year, which was a presidential election year, that the GOP unexpectedly put forward. Everyone expected it to go with an America First candidate. I say America First because that's another big phrase today. I mean, you're talking about parallels, right? I noted with some interest that the budget resolution that the House and Senate are passing through Congress, the one they want to do a reconciliation on, right? It's called the America First budget. So anyway, times are kind of echoing each other there, right? But in that budget that was passed then, they put through these huge new rearmament proposals, enormous. The Two Ocean Navy Act, which more than doubled the size of the U.S. Navy and laid the keels for the Iowa-class battleships and the Essex-class aircraft carriers that would eventually decide the Pacific War. They were laid then. Huge things. Those went through Congress in July with not a single dissenting vote in Congress. Nobody, not even the Republicans, voted against them. And by the end of the year, the economy was already beginning to come up, right? The unemployment rate was falling. GDP growth was growing. Only about a year later do you have Pearl Harbor. And the reason I emphasize that, we often think that America was just sleeping and isolationist until Pearl Harbor. It's not exactly true. The mood shifted with what was happening in Europe and obviously the subsequent Battle of Britain. That was a turning point in the mood. And it does show, by the way, how foreign events can suddenly interfere into what seems just like a domestic political dispute.
Neil, can I just pull on a couple of threads there? The first one being there's this idea of MAGA and how MAGA sees itself as kind of tearing down to rebuild again. I guess this is one of the things that I am trying to reconcile, and that brings me back to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, because one of the big features of the MAGA movement in its early days was this worship of the Constitution and that America. What we want to do is tear the house down to the studs, if you like, with the studs being those two documents, and build them up from there. And it does seem to have morphed into, to your point, we want to tear the house down and start again now. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. And then the other piece of it that I'd love to explore a little more is this community as a solution to the problem, which I think is absolutely right. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on the communities of today. The communities back in the 30s were very much in-person communities. They were local communities, grassroots communities that benefited from direct contact between the members of those communities. Today, the communities are so disparate and they're so widely spread, and they coalesce and they organize, not in person, but on social media and in chat rooms and on Reddit boards and places that we now have all these communities, but they're kind of communities with a small c. They don't have the genuine community aspect of them. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those two in terms of the differences between now and the 1930s.
Yeah, that's great, Grant. There are really two questions. One is this large fissure or contradiction within the MAGA movement, or I should say within the Republican Party, because you could say that there's MAGA on the one side, the traditional Republicans on the other. And here is where it's going to come to a head. When I said that Trump's, all of his executive orders and what he's trying to do is going to run straight into a hostile Supreme Court, I'm not talking about, the three progressive members of the Supreme Court. I'm talking about the entire Supreme Court, including Trump's own appointees, because they are huge proponents of, for instance, the major questions doctrine, which is that any major question has to have the positive and explicit assent of Congress, right? That's how they tore down Biden when Biden tried to get rid of, just basically say to half of everyone on paying student loans, oh, you don't have to pay them anymore. Well, Biden was using some tiny little codicil in the law, says he has the power in exceptional cases to forgive the debts. And he used that little thing to say, okay, half of everyone on student debts doesn't have to pay anymore. The Republicans took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in the Republicans' favor. They said, absolutely, that's right. This is a major question. The president cannot do this, cannot reinterpret a program and fundamentally reshape it in the way that Biden has without Congress giving its assent. There has to be legislation behind this, right? So this is going to hugely slam Trump. Do you see what I mean? I mean, basically, all of these major questions, guys, all these people talking about Chevron deference all the time, right? These are your Federalist Society conservatives on the Supreme Court. They cannot go along with what Trump is doing. And so I totally agree with you there. FDR had his own problems, right? You want to talk about problems. Think about FDR. Half of his Democrats were from the South, and the head of all of his committees were in the South. And they didn't want any of his race equalizing, New Deal programs in the South, right? So FDR had enormous contradictions. I would say, FDR had a very fractious coalition, right, in the 1930s. With regard to communities being local, I think that the mythology of the Popular Front, which is sort of the, all of the sort of what we would have called the progressive side in American politics back in the 1930s, after the mid-1930s, we would have called the Popular Front. And it became called the Popular Front because by that time, the communists were really worried, Hitler took over and, things weren't going their way. So they said, instead of actually fighting capitalists all the time, we better join at least their progressive wing. And so they did, and they did in America as well. So the Popular Front began this whole mythology, you could say, of national community as being in favor of these new democratic socialist, initiatives that FDR had. But it wasn't really cemented as this new community America until World War II. I mean, that's what really cemented it in, because that's when everyone, even those, the great, we like talk about the greatest generation, all volunteering after Pearl Harbor. What they don't say is that many of them a year or two earlier were signing Oxford pledges in the university, swearing never to join an army, to, ever fight against a foreign power and put money into the coffers of profiteering arms industries, right? I mean, that was very popular among isolationists. And isolationism, you could say America first, wasn't just popular in the heartland among, old agricultural folk. It was very popular among young people too in the college campuses and the Ivy League college campuses. That also suddenly turned around.
So we're talking here about, obviously, the effect of World War II and international conflict in unifying the country. But for the time being, at least, we continue to be in more of a sort of civil discord dynamic in the U.S. And I'm curious, Neil, when you look at this country and you look at the Republican Party in particular, who are the various factions, or what are the various factions within the American right that are currently vying for power in your view? I mean, I have my own opinion, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say and if there's any kind of clear winner in that direction.
I'm not sure anybody knows. I mean, I would say we identified two of them.
MAGA and the old ruling elite in the Republican Party, I think you
Yeah,
identified.
this would be, more, what's her name? Governor of South Carolina who ran in the primary.
Nikki Haley.
Yeah, Nikki,
Yeah,
sort of her kind of, Reagan coalition, if you want to say. This would be the probably an older group, right?
The group that a lot of MAGA refer to as neocons.
Yeah, or rhinos. Rhinos, Republican in name only, right? And I think that's the major division. What was fascinating about the Kamala Harris versus Trump election is that Kamala Harris won in the oldest age brackets. I mean, it's a complete inversion of what everyone was always saying, back in 2016. The biggest shift from 2016 to 2024 was that the older age brackets shifted for the Democrats and the younger age brackets shifted toward the Republicans, right? And I would say where they lost and where they're still, I think where they're losing now, if you look at the opinion polls, where they're losing are all those group of older Republicans who just couldn't stand Kamala Harris, couldn't stand Biden, just couldn't stand the direction of the Democratic Party and thought Trump was the better of the two. And, at least they favored a lot of the things he was saying. But they're very, they're horrified as to these innovations in the Constitution he's introducing. And I think what you and Grant have been talking about is his emphasis more on destroying than building. Now, of course, Trump would say you have to destroy to build. That's how bad it is. You know what I mean? That's how bad, that's how sclerotic our system now is. You need to clean it out before you can start building new stuff. And I will say this in favor of Trump. When he was asked, well, all these tariffs bring about a recession, his attitude was kind of, sometimes you just got to bear the pain, to get to a better place. We would all agree with that. My only big objection there was, as long as you get to bear pain, why don't you attack the cause of America's current account deficit, which is the fact that we have a budget deficit that is 6% of GDP. That would cause pain, and that would actually remedy the underlying dynamic that's giving rise to all of this trade imbalance, right? Well, he can't do that, unfortunately. Apparently, that's not the pain he's willing to bear. But I do find it interesting that in his Trump 2.0, unlike Trump 2.1, if there is a Trump put, it's a lot lower on the S&P 500 than it was back then. We don't know where it is. Maybe it's down around, where would you guess, Grant? Around 4,500 or something? It's further down than we thought.
Maybe even lower, depending on how it gets there. I think that's the important, important part, right? If it grinds down there, probably lower. If it goes there in one day.
Or maybe it's in the bond market, it's in yields.
But it is interesting, if he had wanted to have a period of, unpleasantness, and this was, of course, this favors a president, right? If you're going to take the public through a bad time, do it early in your term. I mean, Reagan timed that perfectly. I don't know how many of us recall that, but I mean, he backed Volcker. He said to Paul Volcker, do anything you want. You can take the interest rate as high as you want. We will stop the growth of money supply. I don't care. I don't care how bad the pain is now, because, of course, he didn't know this, but I think he would have sensed 4 years from now, I'll be saying morning again in America, and we'll be running for another term. Now, of course, Trump can't run for another term, but I think he does want to hand off his legacy on a positive note.
So, Neil, I have a question. One of the things I'm hearing more and more is that when people are looking to explain the strategy coming out of the administration, because again, it isn't clear, and that may be by design, but I think there is a lack of clarity. And that's also an interesting juxtaposition, right? Which is you compare FDR to Trump, and it seems only in retrospect, maybe only in retrospect, that there was more a clear articulation of policy coming out of the FDR administration.
Demetri, here, I just interrupt. I actually don't think that's true.
Okay.
I think FDR was an economic lightweight. Hoover understood economics 100 times more than FDR. There was actually a meeting between FDR and Hoover, actually, after he was elected and before the inauguration. Back then it was a longer period. It wasn't until March back then. And the country was in free fall. So the two of them met. And Hoover had this enormous explanation of everything that was going on in the economy. And FDR understood almost none of it. And basically, it's his usual pleasantries. But the difference is FDR attitude was, we're just going to try everything. I think there was no intellectual coherence whatsoever to FDR's New Deal. I think it was just throw everything against the wall. I think the National Recovery Administration was a good case. I mean, they had no idea what they were going to do.
But their goal was to address the Depression. I mean, that was the clear goal. And I guess the equivalent goal in this case is reindustrialization.
I think I understand your question. But a lot of people would have said, the NRA, by actually encouraging price fixing, by actually preventing people from lowering wages. Well, that was actually counterproductive. I mean, that prevented the economy from re-equilibrating, right? In other words, that is exactly what Keynes used to talk about. That keeps the wage level high and makes sure that some people are unemployed, right? In other words, there was no theoretical integrity to the New Deal. The New Deal was a lot of stuff. Some of it worked, some of it didn't.
And maybe it didn't actually work. We only think it worked in retrospect because we had a world war.
Well, exactly, as we talked about before. I mean, definitively, you look about Germany today. Take a look at Germany's economy. Now that it's spending a lot on defense, it's beginning to turn around. That's kind of another analogy we can talk about, right? What's Germany and Europe doing now that it's sort of facing Putin a little bit more mano a mano? How is that changing? But I guess I'm saying a lot of experimentation, not a lot of theoretical clarity. The clarity came later. There was the whole theory of Keynes brought in by Alvin Hansen in the late 1930s. It was really not terribly well understood by the New Deal crowd. Only later, after the war, did everyone then become a Keynesian and understand, all this new economic theory. It really was not planned. The New Deal was a very huge amount of energy, huge amount of new administrations and stuff, a lot of more desperation than a clear theory of what was causing the problem. Remember that FDR, running against Hoover, ran on balanced budgets. He thought that Hoover's Reconstruction Administration subsidies to companies was actually causing too large of a deficit. Anyway, all I mean to say is the confusion, I don't think, differentiates the two. I do agree that what does differentiate the two, one huge one, is the mandate. The mandate was huge for FDR in 1932 and even larger in 1936. And that is a large differentiator. And actually, that's very problematic for America today, right? We don't have a sun party and a moon party. We don't have one major party that can just take over and the other country just do a lot of negotiating as side deals. And that's really what we had by the height of the New Deal and for several decades afterward. Frankly, it was in the House all the way until Newt Gingrich, took over finally got Republicans in the House in 1994, right? So think of how long the Democrats prevailed in the House of Representatives. It was amazing. That was the New Deal generation, and it had huge legs after the war.
Neil, you said something that was almost a throwaway line back there, and I'd love to go back to it because it kind of rung a bell in my head. And that was, you said, of course, Trump can't run for a third term. And
well, as I said actually, I almost took it back and I said,
no, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. But I'm very curious because obviously that is another of the sacred cows that he may try to burn to the ground. And I think, something like that, when I heard that, and I saw yesterday, I think, that he's started to sell Trump 2028 hats in his own personal merch store, which is very on brand. But something like that, a casual Trump aside, not walked back when given the opportunity, something like that can, I think, in the environment we're in, end up being some kind of flashpoint. So I'd be curious for your thoughts on that as to how, because I'm sure he does want to run for a third term. We'll see if the next 3.5 years go terribly. But I'm sure right now he would love to run for a third term. How do you think that might play out?
For the Never Trump crowd, it's very disheartening to see his latest physical. I mean, the guy apparently is in great shape.
Yeah, we can't trust
like
White House doctors.
Linebacker.
I think we've learned from, if we didn't already know it, I think the last 4 years have taught us that we can't trust the White House doctors.
I'm just saying, you read that report, it got all the lab results. They look pretty good. I think a lot of people his age were looking enviously at some of those results. All right, let me propose a kind of dark enlightenment fourth turning. Okay. To me, a darker fourth, because anything's possible, right? Fourth turning is a huge change. Let me propose maybe a darker vision of how this all could turn out.
As if we were going through the optimistic version so far. Go ahead, Neil.
Well, because the optimistic version assumes that, of course, community will prevail. The core of America's fundamental institutions will be preserved, reanimated and revigorated in a new way, right? After the crisis is successfully overcome, right? Through this period of public mobilization and emergency. That is the fourth turning pattern, right? But let me give a somewhat darker view. And we haven't had a lot of these in American history, except maybe if you were a Southerner in 1860, that was a pretty dark end, fourth turning for you. But here's another way it could turn out. And this is if what really is animating Trump and the MAGA is what we could just call patrimonialism. So Trump is just like a Don, He just wants all of these things, tariffs, everything else. He just wants to get a big on everyone's transaction. And frankly, that Donald S. Trump coin, what a perfect bribe vehicle. I mean, who knows whether Putin is putting $1 billion into that coin and Trump is automatically taking it out so it doesn't impact price? No one would ever know. So here's another interpretation, right? That in the end, Trump really doesn't care about U.S. abroad. He would be the non-Wendell Willkie choice in 1940. He would be the Lindbergh choice. You know what I mean? So he's perfectly comfortable with Putin dominating Eastern Europe, and he would be perfectly Putin with Xi dominating the Western Pacific. And who knows, Iran can do what it wants, and Europe can do what it must. And anyway, but the point is, don't have to spend a lot necessarily on defense, but just rig the whole economy so then the maximum amount goes to Trump, and then Trump gets to rule forever. Maybe his family just is in there indefinitely. We could be moving, in this case, the fourth turning could be like the end of the Roman civil wars at the end of the Republic. We could be moving from the Republic to Octavian, going from a Republican society to the Principate, the empire, just having a family, a man, and eventually we'll call him Dominus, like eventually they call Diocletian and Constantine. He'll be the Dominus. Well, that Grant, Demetri, what do you, now this is a darker, I
feel like whenever I've pointed that out, which that seems like, one of the obvious conclusions to draw from things like a presidential meme coin, I get the response of, you just have Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a big part of this because, what we're saying here, and people in their current state find it really difficult to listen to what's being said without doing exactly what you said there, Demetri. And what we're talking about here is a possible dark route that we could go down. We're not saying this is where it's going, but I think the important thing to understand, Neil, is the chance of what you've just described happening is no longer zero. It may be 0.5%, but until 6 months ago, the chance was zero. And it's just not anymore.
I agree. It was unthinkable. And I think what got us there is, everyone, when this polarization began, it's been, rising for the last 25 years, but when it really became extreme after the GFC and the Tea Party and all that, and then obviously with Trump 1.0, everyone sort of said, oh, well, that's okay. People really don't, it doesn't really matter. They don't really care about politics that much. I think now we begin to see it really does matter because these things, for instance, Trump saying that, maybe I will run again. Maybe I just don't give a crap about the Constitution. There was a time when that would have immediately disqualified you, right? And remember why Nixon resigned. I mean, just to go back, right? Why did Nixon resign? It's because the leaders of the party came to the White House and basically told him, sir, a large share of your own party will not vote for you if the impeachment vote comes up in the Senate, right? They will vote to throw you out. That's why he resigned. That would never happen today, right? And I think that's where we are.
It's also not clear who those people would be. If they're not members of the party, who would they be? But, the question that I had that was formulating in my mind now for the last 30 minutes Neil, is that in 1933, a group of Wall Street financiers organized a coup d'etat against FDR, and they sought to have Major General Smedley Butler lead it, who ended up blowing the whistle to Congress, and it foiled the plot. And, when I asked you about who the factions are that are vying for power in this fourth turning, one of the factions that we left off was the sort of tech bros / oligarchs. And they've been in the Trump camp, but, it's not clear if they're going to be in the Trump camp indefinitely because a lot of these tariffs are not popular with them. And I just wonder, is there a chance there that a coalition of actors, of course there's a chance, right? What I'm even asking when I say there's a chance, but I'm just curious what you think of the idea of, we saw the attempted assassination of Trump during when he was campaigning for the presidency. That propelled him into office. It boosted his popularity, but it could have gone the other way. How do you think about the possibility that some sort of faction could seek to overthrow the presidency and install a dictator?
Well, we are going down some dark roads here.
You started it.
I started it. I did, I guess.
Let me just add something. When I had done some interviews in the past, I had raised the possibility of an assassination of Trump during the, before he had been elected and before the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. And I remember one of the guests who I mentioned it to, and this was generally universally the case, I felt like in the conversations I had, it was like, do not ask questions like that. Like, that's totally inappropriate. Don't bring up stuff like that in good company. And yet it happened. And I feel like we're just kind of, it's happened historically. It happened to FDR. And what Trump is doing is so unpopular among certain people who, especially the sort of old guard, that was, maybe a lot of those people have been emasculated or neutered from his first term. But anyway, I just wanted to add that additional context, but please go ahead.
Well, I don't think it really matters. The only conspiracies at work are conspiracies with very small numbers of people. So it only takes a couple of people, really, who have the motivation and opportunity, right, to make it happen. If it's a big conspiracy, it won't work, just by definition. I'll tell you, that's another thing about history I often explain to people. Large-scale conspiracies never, ever work. Just name an example. Even the gunpowder plot didn't work. And that was pretty, that had 12 or 13 people in it, right? Yeah. Even that one was discovered. But the reason I say that is because so many people have this conspiracy idea of history where vast number, thousands and thousands of people can all collaborate. And I just said, that's insane. That never happens. But to come back to your point, well, actually, your point about assassination, but that was leading to another point, Demetri. So repeat what actually.
So my question was really about comparisons to the 1933 Wall Street push, where a group of Wall Street financiers tried to overthrow the FDR administration. I just think, and I'll also say, when I look at this term, I think that any chance of that really happening was more likely to happen in his first term, because I feel like Trump has really consolidated power within the American right. I don't really see a coalition. Back in this first term, he was attacking the intelligence agencies. If there was a power base, it was really in the old guard, in the intelligence community, the, quote, deep state, that could have sought to overthrow him or oppose him. And I think that we're past that now. I don't think that that's likely, but I wanted to throw it out there because an interesting comparison that most people don't know, which is that things could have gone very differently in 1933, and FDR may have been overthrown in a coup d'etat.
Yeah. History is very contingent, right? And I will say, maybe I'll take this question in a little bit different direction than you wanted me to, but I think one issue about history is contingency. Even the smallest things happen, which really change history. A great example is the fact that Henry Wallace was not renominated to be vice president in 1944 when FDR ran for his final term. He was this close. He was literally a millimeter away till finally one of FDR's bosses ran up on the convention and introduced Harry Truman and said, no, we got to get Harry Truman. And everyone booed him down. It was a very near-run thing because FDR was perfectly fine going with Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace, it turned out, was hugely positive about Joseph Stalin, thought that Stalin made the Soviet Union run like a top. It was a great idea how to run a government. It would be great to have Stalin, telling Europe how to run its governments. And remember that FDR died 3 months later, right, from a heart attack. So that would have been Henry Wallace at the beginning of the it's unimaginable, right? And I will say, in all fairness to Henry Wallace, a rather interesting guy, a guy interested in agriculture and how to grow corn. And he was a very interesting guy from the Midwest. But later on, in the late 50s. He admitted, he said, I was completely wrong about Stalin. Well, that's too bad. That's waking up a little bit late, right? But my point is, think about how history would have been, right? And the reason I bring that up is that people often ask me about, these turnings, because I look at history from a very large pattern perspective. And everyone says, how do you account for that kind of thing, right? How do you account for just an event like that, or an assassin's bullet, or a battle that went the other way? If the U.S. had lost in Midway or something like that. And the answer is, ultimately, is that leaders are made, not born. That leaders come into where they are because they have no real other option. They always move to the void. They always move to where they are beckoned to go. I think Trump is in this position today, not because he maliciously pushed America into it, but because America was ready for him. I really do. I think America it just was wanting a guy like Trump, for better or for worse. And, the question is, I'm not going to respond to the question of whether there might be 2 or 3 motivated people out there who might want to do harm to Trump. I mean, God knows. I guess that's always a possibility. But I will say that, to Grant's point, the possibility was 0. Now the possibility is non-zero. And I think that alone affects America's sensibility of itself and what it could become in a very different way than they had before.
Neil, let me, if I may, just switch tacks a little bit and go outwards a little bit from America. Another thing that both Demetri and I have noticed in our conversations, in our podcasts, in our communications, correspondence with people, is lighter, and that is a return to religion, a return to spirituality. And we've seen in the last 10 days or so, particularly here in the UK where I am at the moment, we've seen all kinds of data about church going in the UK. The Church of England is seeing a surge in attendance, particularly amongst young men. So in terms of shifting from the dark to the light, can you talk a little bit about the place that spirituality and religion have in a fourth turning as a kind of antidote to the inevitable darkness?
Yeah, this is going in a lighter direction. So
yeah, it's time.
In America, very interesting data just came out by Pew Research Institute, kind of the gold standard in measuring religious affiliation and religious practice in America. They came out with their new report, which basically said that after, several decades of decline in religious affiliation, the share of Americans who feel they're Christian or feel they're any religion, the rise of the nuns. In other words, people saying they're no religion, none, right? None as in nothing. And it went a little bit further during the pandemic, but now in the last 3 years, it's actually come back. It's the first time we've seen it. So we're basically level with where we were in 2018 and 2019 in terms of share of Americans who affiliate as Christians. That's remarkable in and of itself, because we've never seen that much of a correction in several decades going back, since boomers came of age and kind of liberated us all of, I think, less liberated us from actually going to church. I think more liberated us from the feeling that we had to tell pollsters that we ought to go to church. It's mainly liberating us from hypocrisy, perhaps. But I'll tell you, in the data, the most interesting thing was the very youngest people. It was 18 to 25 who showed no decline relative to the older millennials, 25 to 35, which was remarkable. And in that data, because you mentioned men, and particularly going back to church, the most remarkable thing in these young people is that men actually register slightly higher than women in the share saying they're Christian, which is completely different from any older age bracket. And this goes way back, by the way, historically. Women have always been more likely to say they're religious or Christian than men. But I will say, to interpret this, Grant, let me just raise one more thing. The denomination that's increased the most is not any particular denomination. It's just non-denominational. So a lot of these men are non-denominational. And the interesting possibility that has been raised by some people looking at the Pew data is whether or not, for these young men, Christian is simply a conservative identifier. In other words, if you're conservative, you should be Christian, right? That's kind of an identifier. In other words, that's what Liliana Mason once called a meta brand. In other words, conservatism is the meta brand, and MAGA is the meta brand, and as part of that, you're supposed to fill in Christian. But even if so, hypocrisy often leads people into the most interesting places, right? And it is still very interesting. This gets back to what I said earlier. Remember, we were talking about this. Are we in the midst of a conservative turn in the culture? This obviously would be evidence to that. I would point out, too, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, right? Admitted the other day after the Supreme Court ruling that trans men really are women after all. Apparently, the Supreme Court ruling has changed his mind on this, right? So,
yeah, amazing.
This is remarkable. And I'm just thinking, this is the leader of the Progressive Party in Britain. And I'm just wondering, are we going to hear Kamala Harris come out and say, I changed my mind?
I still don't even know exactly. It's the vortex in which we found ourselves in the last 10 years was so confusing. And I think most of us, at least older, again, I'm an older millennial, I still didn't even fully understand what exactly we were arguing about in terms of what makes a man and what makes a woman and some of the more ridiculous hypotheses that were put forward there. But is there a consistency across fourth turnings when it comes to interest in gender roles?
Yeah, this is what I was pointing out before. In fourth turnings, from beginning to end, the differences between gender roles always widen. That is actually a rule. In other words, coming out of World War II is we have the famous American high when, man were manly men. You just look at Hollywood, right? I mean, there were, and the women were, very much, that's when, we're helpmates, we're homemakers. And in fact, even in schools, that was put into the curriculum. That was what women are supposed to do. And this is an old pattern. And obviously it's related to more the Apollonian, more the creative, the constructive, when you're building the outer world, that's much more, traditionally the man's realm. Exploring the inner world has always been historically where women often have been out in the forefront of our culture. This is why awakenings have very often coincided with a narrowing of gender roles, gender role differences. We certainly saw that in the 60s and 70s. So in other words, that's when I said I had always been expecting this in the fourth turning, widening again of gender role differences. And I'm suggesting that we may be beginning to see this.
One other thing that I've noticed is that, when I was growing up, drugs and alcohol were cool. And it seems also like in the last few years, more of what is the popular culture has come down negatively on drugs and alcohol, even on things like marijuana. And I'm curious if you've noticed that as well, and if that also speaks to this turning and sort of rising conservatism in the country.
Yeah, typically on substance abuse. Now, it varies depending on what the substance abuse is known for, right?
But not even substance abuse in this case. I mean, what we're seeing with alcohol is there's a real interest in kind of, quote, healthy living. And obviously alcohol consumption in any kind of significant quantity is not consistent with that. And this is an interesting thing that I've noticed. There's an interest, at least among men, among the male cohort, an interest in healthier living, in bodybuilding, in martial arts. And part of that has also been a rebuke of drugs and alcohol, even though some of the older folks like Joe Rogan, they still, might smoke weed on their show or drink alcohol. But among younger demographics, I do seem to see this. And I'm curious, I guess, if you've seen it and if that has any consistent...
Well, absolutely, you've seen it. Both smoking and alcohol consumption have gone way down among younger cohorts over the past 30 years, right? So that you've seen. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a broader pattern of that. Typically in a third turn, it goes up. In a first turning, it goes up a lot during an awakening when substance abuse becomes popular. Everyone kind of want to break social norms and explore themselves and so on. And it typically starts going down again during third turning, and it goes further down in a fourth turning. Interestingly enough, alcohol consumption reached its all-time peak in America. I can't remember the figures, something like 3 or 4 gallons per capita per year, right at the mid-1830s, which was near the end of the Jackson era, which was an awakening. It was the second great awakening in American history. Alcohol consumption went down by 50% by the time the Civil War started. There was a huge temperance movement in America, which brought down, it was very successful. And you saw the same thing. It rose again after the Civil War and became a huge problem in World War I, and then obviously we enacted prohibition because it was such a huge problem, and it peaked again and it started going down starting in the 30s, and it went down in the 40s, 50s, and then it started rising again in the 60s. So my point is that there is a rhythm to these things. There are exceptions. I mean, you see fentanyl, which is addiction to opioids, and that was one of the things that was really brought into vogue really by the healthcare establishment, because they started prescribing all of these opioids. But I do see that, and I do think that definition of the young male as someone who's healthy, as someone who doesn't partake of all these things, that I think became even an issue in Pete Hegseth's hearings. You remember, he has had a problem with alcohol abuse in the past, and I think that sort of was a little bit of something that more than normally was held against him. Apparently not against him enough, because he went through the confirmation hearings. But yeah, I definitely do see that pattern.
Neil, can I take us full circle back to the beginning of the conversation again? And we talked at the beginning about the fact that full turnings have a lot of broad characteristics that they share. And you can look from a 30,000 foot level and you can look for things that you expect to happen, the tearing down of institutions, the conflict, the rising conflict, all the characteristics of a full turning that you and Bill laid out so beautifully for everybody. And then we talked about how there's so much chaos and so much that we didn't see coming that's happening right now. When you get down to that micro level and you're actually in the weeds of what it actually means to be in a full turning. But if we zoom back out again, what are the characteristics that perhaps sit in the framework at the top level that you either haven't seen yet, or you're looking for, or you expect to maybe come next as we move through this period?
By this time, that's hard to know. Like, how much more do you want to see, Grant? I mean,
none. I don't want to see any more. I'm ready for the first turning. Please.
You're ready to go all the way, right? Yeah,
we're both ready for the party to begin.
Yeah. Everyone
I'm just curious as to whether there are any glaring missing pieces yet that you haven't seen fall into place.
Well, in the terminology that I lay out, when you talk about stages of a fourth turning, right? Obviously, the catalyst is long behind us, and regeneracy. We've seen the regeneracy. We may have seen yet another regeneracy, with Trump 2.0 kind of going off in a somewhat different direction. Typically, there's more than one regeneracy. What we haven't seen is the decisive moment when the struggle is joined. We know on what terms the ultimate conflict will be about, right? We did not know what it would be in World War II until Pearl Harbor. Now, as I suggested, that America began to change in its mood well before Pearl Harbor. But that point at which we knew that the battle for the country's survival was joined, we had no idea what the outcome was, but it was joined, really was made clear with Pearl Harbor, right? And that actually is a stage, that I lay out. And I point out in all the previous four turnings when we hit that stage. We haven't hit that yet. We have no idea what the terms will be. As I said, the biggest question, and when I talk a lot in the book about my most recent book in particular, because I lay that out very explicitly, is this question between internal and external. Because this is what's fascinating to me. You can have a society practically about to fragment into pieces internally, when suddenly it can be galvanized by an external event. And that was indeed the case with World War II. America was very divided during the 1930s. A lot of America thought that we were headed toward fascism. The other thought we were headed toward communism. The liberal democracy seemed dead. And so there was a tremendous division. There was a tremendous polarization. And then suddenly something else happened, right? And we galvanized around something else. We don't know what that something else is. We see both possibilities clearly enough. I think we haven't talked much about external, but it's out there in the headlines, right? We see it around there. There are a lot of hot spots around in the world, right? And keep in mind this, that these turnings are now not just American, they're global, right? These global we see the rise of these ethnocentric autocratic rulers everywhere. I mean, they seem to be popular everywhere. Everyone wants to make their country, great again,
Also, I think, Neil, isn't there just a general longing for order?
And
I feel it.
Community, order, and validation, collective validation, right? And that's it. And we see that even with this recent blow up between Pakistan and India. You'd think, okay, yeah, there's a terrorist incident. You really want to go to war over that? Well, India, Narendra Modi finds it hard to resist. This is the beating heart of the BJP, this Hindu nationalism. It's been affronted. How can it back down? How can it accept this loss of face? But this is the world we live in today. So I think we see the dangers around globally as well.
Yeah, I just want to say, going back all the way back to the beginning of the conversation where I said, Trump is focused more on tearing down the institutions, whereas FDR was more focused on building them up. What I should have also said was that the insight I should have had that I got later in the conversation is institutions don't have to be political institutions. Those can be institutions of the family, religious institutions, and so on. And I think that does resonate with me. I think we've gone through such a long stage of tearing things down. I mean, during the previous administration, the whole woke movement was so much about tearing down cultural institutions and institutional frameworks that we had in our heads about whether we're talking about gender roles or other things. And I do think there's a kind of exhaustion, I certainly feel it here in the U.S., around just the permissibility of everything and a desire to kind of bring some order to things and to establish lines of demarcation and a collective sense of identity.
Yeah, I agree with that. Remember that one of his proclamations, I can't remember if this was an inauguration or whether this was his first address to Congress, but he talked about the revolution of common sense. So he wants to bring all of these social relationships back into affirm sort of their historical legitimacy. And then he's spending a lot of energy on that. A lot of his executive orders have to do with purging DEI from federal, not only federal government, but companies that work with the federal government, companies that accept universities accept federal money. He's out there. In other words, there's a lot of energy going into that. These common sense or almost ancestral. This is when I said ethnocentric. I kind of mean it. I mean, I think Trump shares some of that too. We have roots, we have ethnicity, we have traditions, we have something that's been validated by a long history. We need to reaffirm these things. And in that sense, what's the difference between him and Xi Jinping, who's doing that now with traditional Han culture? I mean, the big thing in China now is these Confucian institutes and Han clothing and Han cooking, and it's all coming back. It's amazing too, because you think back during the Cultural Revolution, Xi Jinping's generation, when it was teenagers, they tried to actually eradicate all of that traditional stuff. Now they're trying to bring it all back, right? But this is happening around the world. Particularly, I would say, what's really interesting to me is in Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe faces a unique problem. Not only do they have a low fertility rate, they have a high emigration rate. And I'll say this as a demographer, right? People often say to me, I don't understand it. These Eastern European countries, they're so averse to immigration from Syria, from various places. Why is it? I mean, they're losing population. And I think it's very simple. The Eastern European leaders know that the members of their country, Romanians, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Poles, they can easily go, they still have the Schengen zone, right? They can always just move to Western Europe. If it's only about the wages, they'll move out. They have to give natives to the place a reason to stay there. They have to give them a sense that this is a country of their roots. You bring in 5 million Syrians, it's going to seem less like a country of their roots. And this is why these countries have been the most averse to immigration, despite the fact that they face the biggest population challenges. They know that that's a losing game. That's a negative cycle downward, right? You'll just have more people emigrating. But I'm just saying these are interesting in how we see them in so many different areas of the world today. This trend toward, vaunting the powerful leader in charge of an integrated community capable of action based on its heritage is not just in America. It's not even primarily in America. It's all around the world, and it involves the same generations, assuming, their various roles.
Neil, on that and this internal, external, these differences we talked about a little while ago, it seems to me as I kind of try and piece all this together that the nature of the fourth turnings in Western Europe are very, very similar. characterized by leadership change, not always left to right, but sometimes right to left, but just a tiredness with the ruling class and a want for change. And we see the conflict, we see immigration being a major issue, to your point there about Eastern Europe. And I'm seeing that right across Western Europe and the Western world in general. The nature of the fourth turning in perhaps the Middle East and Asia, I'd be curious as to, A, whether the turnings, you see them being synchronized, but they're just slightly different in nature in the Middle East and the Asia, or whether they're slightly behind the West in the nature of their fourth turning, and what it looks like ultimately when we get to that external part of the fourth turning, what it looks like not just in local fourth turnings, but a global fourth turning.
Yeah, I think, look, in South Asia, East Asia, and much of Latin America, I think it's very similar to the US, perhaps slightly behind. Even Western Europe is slightly behind. Western Europe had its 60s a little bit later, right, than America did. America emerged from World War II. Really, its first turning started earlier too, right? We were prosperous right off the bat in 1946. Europe was still in the rubble, right? So there's a little bit of a lag. But I would say the last fourth turning was a fourth turning, obviously, for all of Europe, including Russia, obviously, for China, for Japan, for India. That was its independence, and a violent independence it was. We're living with that today, with this new blow up between, in the Kashmir, right? So that's pretty synchronous. And the same goes with a lot of Latin America. You remember during the 1960s, we had the disappearances of youth. We had the massacres in Mexico City. A lot of it involved youth in huge groups who were rebelling or revolting against the big, powerful institutions built by their parents, their fathers especially. That was a theme here in America. It was a theme in Santiago. It was a theme in Mexico City. It was a theme in a lot of Latin American countries. I would say the only part of the world which is a somewhat different generational cycle, lagging maybe a whole generation, would be the Islamic majority countries. Many of them had their revolutions about a generation later, really late 50s, early 60s. Osama bin Laden, which is, you might think of as the oldest of the sort of boomer awakening archetypes, right, was born in the late 1950s. You know what I mean? And the great Islamic awakening started in 1979. It started with the Mujahideen, the resistance to Russia, the takeover of Mecca, and obviously the Iranian Revolution. I mean, all of that was really, so you can see their awakening started much later. It's kind of a later pattern, interestingly enough. So I'm fascinated by this. I'm fascinated by generational currents and what I see. And, that could actually impact how we negotiate with, the Arab countries and with Iran, as we're now doing.
At the risk of overtaxing our faculties or competencies on the subject of the Middle East, Neil, I am curious how your framework applies to Israel, which prior to October 7th was dealing with a turbulent period of political upheaval and constitutional crisis that saw large-scale protests take place across the country, and which since October 7th has seemed to come together in common solidarity against an external enemy by being thrown into a different sort of crisis. And it does seem that, generally speaking now, there is a kind of reordering of sorts happening in the Middle East, with one pole being led by the Saudi-Israeli-American axis and the other by Iran and its backers. Is there any insight to draw here by applying your framework to the shifts that are going on in that part of the world?
It's interesting. I've actually done some sessions with Israelis, Israeli business leaders, actually, who have wanted to talk to me about this, because I think there's a huge feeling among Israelis that October 7th really was their fourth turning, right? I mean, this is exactly, a lifetime, 80 years or so after the birth of their country. A lot of them see it as existential to their country's survival, right? This assault on many fronts orchestrated by Iran, from Hezbollah to the Houthis to the Hamas and, all the rest of it. So I think there's a huge sense that it's kind of the once and for all, right? We need to, never again requires that at some point we step up and make big decisions. I don't think that was around 10 years ago, that we have to take advantage of the opportunity to really make sure it never happens again. It's interesting that the Begin doctrine which is that whole doctrine, of never allowing another neighboring country that wants to annihilate us in the area ever get a nuclear weapon, has informed many of their decisions to bomb, nuclear weapons programs in Syria and Iraq and so on. And they want to follow through with it. We just had the news that apparently Netanyahu was planning an attack in May. Apparently Trump told him he put it off because we're in negotiations now. But I will tell you, this is what we're talking about, archetypal movements as societies move into fourth turnings. In awakenings, a society starts taking more chances in individuals and start taking fewer chances as a nation, right? Collectively. And in a fourth turning, the opposite happens. People tend to be more risk averse personally, but they take bigger risks as collectivities, right? Decisive acts to permanently solve problems, which had lingered around for a long time. I think, by the way, you see a lot of that in Trump and the movement that supports Trump. I think a lot of the emotion that is supportive of Trump is simply, I don't care if we break these rules. We've been trying to deal with these problems since I was born, and I just can't stand it anymore. We solve this problem now. I just, I don't care what it is, but we got to put an end to it. And there's that sense of impatience. And we can't just simply hand this problem off again to our kids.
Neil, I've just got one more question if I can for you, but it's a pretty broad one. I'm curious to your thoughts on what this looks like for China. With your demographer's hat on, obviously they have a pretty significant demographic challenge awaiting them. What does the fourth turning look like for China? Because it does have different characteristics to the US and Western Europe, and obviously a fourth turning rippling through China will be significant for the rest of the world, whether we're peaceful or confrontational.
Yeah, I mean, China is obviously the big question. That's the number one competitor for the United States. I think this is for the last decade and a half. That's kind of all of our intelligence reports keep reiterating that the sort of the pacing threat, as we like to call it. We've had administration after administration saying they want to divert resources to Asia. I think this administration really is absolutely determined to do that. And the big question is, what kind of compromise can America make at heading off what could be, obviously, a very major confrontation, a war, right? Meaning, I think it boils down really to the South China Sea and Taiwan above all. And the real question is, if the U.S. somehow cedes Taiwan to China, the big impact, we can talk about computer chips if we want. That's one aspect of it. But maybe we could find some way to, export their industries or something, to some other place. But I think the other issue, the big issue, is what effect will that have on American allies in the region? And would that simply lead to the Finlandization of those countries and eventually being subsumed themselves, right? This is a problem. This is why American leaders, American presidents have tended to draw the line there. I would say these increasing problems that China has with managing its economy, keeping its productivity rate up, it can't simply continue to invest in vast kinds of infrastructure that no one lives in or no one wants. And it can't keep expanding its exports of goods to the rest of the world. Increasingly, the rest of the world doesn't want them, or, their economies can't function well with that. And I think more broadly, the fact that its working age population is already shrinking. And everyone knows what its long-term demographic situation is. By the 2040s, it's going to be losing 10 million people a year. I mean, it's just going to be shrinking very, very fast. This actually, I think, pulls up the sort of necessary window of opportunity for China. This is sort of the old power transition theory, whereby countries that think they need to resolve a confrontation, when it appears that their window of opportunity is closing, meaning long-term trends are no longer in their favor, are likely to act sooner rather than later. Keep in mind, if you go back 10 or 15 years, when the Chinese thought there wasn't really a demographic problem, their productivity differential over the United States was huge, the long-term trend looked great. So it didn't matter. There was no reason to have a confrontation now. The longer we wait, the more powerful we are, right? There was nothing that would force any near-term action. I don't think they see that anymore. And I think Xi Jinping has been trying to prepare his people for, stormy wind and high seas, or however, he puts it in his metaphors and his speeches. The Chinese need to be prepared for this in looking out at their geopolitical future. So I don't know, Grant. Let me ask you. I mean, what do you see in that possible confrontation?
Well, I think for me, it's the problem of it is it could go either way, and it really is on a knife edge. And to your earlier point about externalities, I suspect Xi Jinping is looking for an excuse to do it rather than doing it of his own volition. He would love to have something to point at, the way Putin did with the troops on the border in Ukraine and the NATO ascension debate. I don't know that Xi gets something like that. But again, when we've talked in the past in this conversation about the unifying effects that conflict has, Xi Jinping has a very juicy unifying conflict sitting across a 50 or 100 mile odd strait.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I suspect it won't necessarily be something that happens organically. It will be a decision that's made, and it won't necessarily be about unifying China. It won't necessarily be about we need to get Taiwan back in the fold. It will be, okay, we need to do something here, and this is going to be our best option. And that's kind of what worries me, is that it will be a means to an end rather than something that is strategically important to do, because that makes it a lot more unpredictable.
Well, the admirals who were head of the Indo-Pacific Command have basically said their exercises around Taiwan are getting so large that it's almost impossible to differentiate between an exercise and preparation.
Right, and a full-scale invasion.
You know what I mean? And that's when you start worrying, and they have these enormous, they're apparently experimenting with these enormous bridges that they can bring up to the landing beaches, and actually to be able to ferry huge amounts of armored vehicles. I mean, we have images of all this stuff. We're looking at their equipment. It does seem like they have a plan, right? This is not just our thinking this might happen. I mean, clearly they're preparing for this, and where they're putting their resources are all into a venture that is something like this. Yeah, it would be nice to have an excuse. Of course, they could always make an excuse. The president of Taiwan says something that goes one step too far about, saying something about Taiwan being independent or something like that. They're also, I think it's worth saying, spending huge amounts of diplomatic energy isolating any country that dares to have a relationship with Taiwan. I mean, all this does suggest that they're trying to set this up. You can't help but think they're trying to set up this. So I think the bigger question is how America responds. I think China's leadership, I think no question that this is what it wants. It seems to be preparing for it. The real question is how, and particularly how Trump responds. I think it would have been much easier to say how other recent presidents would have responded, right? But I think that becomes a very, look, Trump has appointed many people who are, including Colby, Marco Rubio, I mean, a number of these, Waltz, a lot of his closest advisors are very anti-China.
Yeah.
And so the real question is, however, maybe as vice president, maybe J.D. Vance, maybe a little bit less so. Maybe some of the other people aren't as interested in the Pacific, right? But I do suspect that that's going to be a big moment. And then, of course, the question is, if China feels the only way to get an edge is to take out America, it's a little bit like the Pearl Harbor problem, right? In other words, you have to strike first and take out American capabilities so you can get that 1 month, those 30 days, so you can really get your forces into Taiwan, right?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily have any other questions. I mean, I would just share the concerns. I think it's hard to know, for me at least, what the perspective is of the leadership in Beijing when they look at the rhetoric coming out of both parties in the U.S., the bipartisan consensus on China, the semiconductor export controls, now these tariffs that are basically like 165%. That's basically,
I think. Yeah, it's the latest number, but
that's basically a trade embargo.
And he promises, by the way, he might cut them in half, so they'll only be like 85%.
Yeah, I mean, so like that does concern me more so than some of the more theoretical arguments about there being a kind of window of opportunity and driven by demographic shifts. I don't know that, again, I don't have some special insight here, but I don't necessarily think that the Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping are particularly eager on taking a big risk on and trying to take Taiwan. However, I do think that the actions coming out of Washington, combined with maybe an inability to really forge cooperative alliances and an alliance structure and an economic bloc to try and contend with the rise of China, I think that could lead to or make more likely an outbreak of war. And God help us if that were the case. I think it's also possible to consider the possibility that really war is much less likely than we think because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the integration of our economies. I get that Norman Angell would have said the same thing back in 1914, but I still think that that's a real possibility. And God help us if we were to find ourselves in another great power conflict today, because it could easily escalate into new fronts in cyberspace or outer space without even needing to go nuclear to create a real humanitarian catastrophe.
Well, you look at Ukraine war. You could have said that could have been nuclear, right? In fact, when Putin was losing, he talked a lot about using tactical nukes. That's typically when a nuclear power threatens, by the way, to use nuclear weapons, always when it's losing. This has been actually why many of the political scientists who look at the nuclear peace after World War II said this has been profoundly conservative or status quo, this nuclear peace, because the only time when a country would realistically threaten use of nukes is when it's losing, rarely when it's attacking.
That's a great example also because, there were people like Michael McFaul, who was ambassador to Moscow, not at the time, but had been, who was advocating letting the Ukrainians shoot missiles into Moscow or giving them F-16s right at the outbreak of the war. And so you can see that, it really also depends. You can't appease, but you also can't go overboard. And it does matter, what kind of heads are prevailing in those situations.
Well, it does. Use of nukes if you're losing. I think that's the main danger for either side. Even the United States endorsed first use of nuclear weapons during the height of the Cold War back in the 1970s. If all those tanks came through the Fulda Gap and our forces weren't strong enough, we basically told the USSR we would use nukes to stop them. It's funny that we forget that America actually has endorsed first use. It's not just Vladimir Putin, but any country will threaten to do that if it seems to be facing an unacceptable loss, loss of face, loss of power, loss of whatever it started with. But I do believe that, the contrary to many people's expectation, a fight in the Western Pacific would not necessarily be short, could go on for a long time. The illusion that big wars will be quickly decided has been belied again and again and again throughout history, right? World War I, World War II, Crimean. You just go through all the examples of these wars that we thought would be quick. They may not be. Typically, big wars between great powers that have a lot of resources and are well motivated, they only end when one side or the other is worn down logistically and morale, and frankly, is exhausted. And in the process, those years transform both societies into somewhat different countries by the time it's over, right? That gets into fourth turning as a social transformation. We won't be the same country after emerging from a long struggle like that.
Neil, thank you so much for joining us and for, let's say, helping us kick the series off. We are excited to see where it goes, and we may be calling on you again once we come full circle and we've got a lot more stuff to talk about and more questions for you.
Yeah, we might be in another phase of the fourth turning, so we might have to rejoin this. But again, thank you, the dream team, the two of you. I'll just say Michael and Magic. Anyway, it was a delight.
Yeah, I like this. I like this dream team illusion.
Okay, Neil, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Okay.
Take care,
bye.
Neil.
Well, mate, what a first step on this journey that was. Absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, every conversation I've had with Neil over the years has been just mind-boggling and mind-expanding, and I've loved every single one of them. But that was, to be having this conversation, not just thinking you're in the middle of a fourth turning, but being demonstrably in the middle of one, and having so many people recognize that now, adds another dimension to it. I thought it was terrific.
Yeah, I feel like in conversations that you and I have had, both public and private, And as well as with some other folks, that keeps coming up often, which is that, for those of us that have sat around thinking about these subjects for years, the key difference now is that we're kind of beginning to live inside of the vortex that we were trying to describe or think about conceptually.
Yeah, it feels that way. It really does. And every day brings change, and some of it is big. But again, I think having this fourth turning framework is a huge advantage in being able to step back and not just get completely caught up in all the madness, but try and step far enough back to see it as its part in the bigger picture. It certainly, as I said at the beginning of the show, it certainly helps me keep things in perspective and remain, if not totally calm and unflustered by it, certainly more objective about it and where it might fit in.
One of the things I liked about this conversation also is that we hit so many different subjects or themes like religion, drug and alcohol usage, gender roles, geopolitics, wealth and income inequality. I think that's especially helpful because what I think we both wanted to accomplish with this first episode was to take as wide a lens as possible. And I think we were able to accomplish that.
I do. Well, listen, our thanks to Neil for joining us. If you haven't read Neil's books, all of them, Generations and The Fourth Turning with Bill Strauss, and Neil's new book, which was released last year, which is The Fourth Turning is Here. They're all magnificent reads, and you can find them just about every major bookseller. You'll find them online, obviously, at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Waterstones and all those places. So if you haven't read them, I cannot recommend them strongly enough. And Neil has his own website, demographyunplugged.com. There's a podcast that Neil does that talks about demographic issues. They're terrific. I think they're every week. They may be every 2 weeks, but they're regular and they're just fantastic. And a lot of what Neil talks about and a lot of the work Neil does is going to, I truly believe, become even more important than it is now. So I think he's going to be an invaluable follow for everybody listening.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Definitely recommend checking out Neil's work. And I tried to get a hardcover copy. I don't know about you, Grant, but I hate softcover books. Absolutely hate them. And unfortunately, Neil's book, The Fourth Turning, is one of those books that you just cannot find in a hardcover unless you pay a fortune from some kind of, antique bookseller. So go on Amazon and get that softcover copy.
I should also point out that Neil is on Twitter also at Howe Generation, Howe Generation. So follow Neil there as well. If you want to follow Demetri and I, we're both on Twitter. You'll find Demetri at Kofinas, Kofinas. You'll find me at TTMYGH. And of course, don't forget to visit hiddenforces.io to follow all Demetri's work there. And you'll find everything you need to know about me at grant-williams.com. That's it from us for another episode. We'll be back with another very special guest in the not too distant future. Until then, as always, thank you everybody for listening.
I'm looking forward to it. Take care, everyone.